Welcome to the ZNL Podcast, a podcast brought to you by ZN, the OG digital agency in Brussels.
And welcome to this episode of ZNL. I am so happy to have Shada Islam as our very special guest. Shada is a very experienced person across a different range of activities. She's been very active in journalism as the editor of the EU Observer. She also writes for The Guardian, the EU Observer, and she is a moderator consultant for the New Horizons project, her company, and she's been a director of policy for Friends of Europe. So really a very broad experience across the board. So welcome to the show. Very happy to have you with us today.
And I'm going to go so much, Phil. Lovely to be here.
Thank you. And I'm going to go to our first question, which is really about the journalistic experience that you have. We've seen some really big trends in journalism, moving from the traditional idea of journalists who are experts, who research topics, to this new generation of kind of podcast journalists. So my first question to you is, how do you see those changes? And how significant are they? Are we moving away from traditional journalism? Is journalism dying, or is there hope for traditional journalism?
So, Philip, I'm actually very excited about today's world in journalism. I don't take the view that journalism is dying. I think the different types of journalism that we're seeing today, different types of reporting. When I started off almost four decades ago, journalism was a very different animal. We were told to be impartial. We were not supposed to be subjective. We were speaking truth to power. It was fun, and I was here in the beginning. The press room was very small. We were very few female journalists. And I started out writing for a newsletter, which was the Politico of the day, if you like, called Agence Europe. And I was really in the midst of EU policy making, the insider, but also trying very hard to maintain my outsider status, because I think you can get too close to power, and that's not what I wanted. And then I started working for a magazine called the Far Eastern Economic Review, published in Hong Kong. And they wanted the stories that were relevant to Asia, to Africa. And so, it was fun to do. And the press room was a completely different beast then. Now we're living, as you said, in a world where change is very much in the air. The traditional legacy media, if you like, I think has a major problem adapting. Obviously, many are online and some are doing it very successfully. But I think the adaptation is still quite slow. But I'm excited by the new breed as well. I mean, I actually like to be on social media. I love the podcasts, and I think it's very good that so many of us are now going on YouTube or Substack and telling our stories without the editors coming in, and so it's a very diverse field. And what I also like, I have to say, Philip, is we were told when we were growing up as journalists, if you like, keep yourself out of the story. But now more and more, the people I work with, and I encourage writers to bring in their personal element into the story, their feelings, why they've chosen the topic, the people they meet. I think it makes for more personal, emotional journalism. And I think that empathy, or lack of, I think opinions matter. So I'm actually quite excited about it. I think we're living through a period of transition. And what I'm loving about it, Philip, is I'm hearing voices from the global south around the world that we didn't hear before. The untold stories. We're listening to journalists in Gaza, journalists in Sudan, journalists in Myanmar. Their stories are being told on social media. And I think that, for me, is such an important factor. We need diversity, and we need to hear the opinions of others as well. So that there's no dominant player at the moment. And I think that's good. That's good.
Yeah, it's a very interesting points. And actually, we have this, democratization of news, because basically it's true that now anyone can take their phone and start sharing stories across different media. I think that the fear was, and I hear this a lot in Brussels, that these are not professional journalists, so they don't do the research, they just have opinions. So it's this tension. What's also interesting is that journalists are moving to the web, and we do our influencer ranking, and you are one of our EU influencers. And basically, these are a lot of journalists are very good at this because they have been writing, they know how to express themselves, so they're really taking advantage of these new channels. So you mentioned how it's important for diversity, how it's important for hearing stories you might not hear otherwise. How do you think this is playing out in the bubble, where there's a big press corps? You mentioned your experience with this press corps. Are they embracing this? Are they worried about it? And is that changing in Brussels? Because Brussels takes time to adapt, I think it's fair to say.
Yeah, I think that's very, very fair to say. The whole ecosystem of Brussels, the institutions, the consultancies, the journalists, the lobbies, it's a very slow process of adaptation to a very quickly changing world. And I think we suffer from that. I agree with you. I think there's a mix in our press rooms today. I mean, I don't really go there anymore. I write op-eds now. I write columns. I'm not doing the reporting anymore, so I don't need to go there. In fact, I'm glad I don't go there. I feel blessed that I don't have to go there, because when I used to be a journalist, it sounds like this old lady sitting there and saying, "Oh, in my good old days." But actually, that there was real communication between the spokespeople and the journalists. We asked difficult questions. We got answers, which were, I think, much less slick and smooth than they are now. We've got a real PR machine at the Commission now, sort of giving out PR material more than communication, I think. We can talk about that later if you like. But I think what's happening now is a mix of things. So there is a new breed of journalists in Brussels who are doing really serious investigation and putting out the stories in the EU Observer, in the Guardian, and elsewhere. But then there's also the older media, the stalwarts of the profession, if you like. And I think they're adapting quite well as well. I mean, the morning newsletters that come in from everybody, I'm not going to mention names, but all of them coming in, I think that is adaptation. But Philip, we used to sort of be quite condescending towards what we used to call citizens journalism, as you said, just people going forward and filming themselves. I think there's a lot of worth in that. I think now, as you know, we use that as journalists. We use citizens journalism. We call it something else regularly. I think the more voices are heard, and we can select, we have to be very sure of who we're talking to. Obviously, you don't just pick up just about anyone and get their voice, the vox pop kind of thing. But I think it's important to give people a voice in today's world. It's part of democracy. Whether it's the extreme right, which we hear a lot about, because that's the big thing, isn't it? It's clickbaits, right? The extremists get the voices, but also the voices of moderation. I think it's important that we have that variety. And on the question of diversity, Philip, I think we are really not doing very well. I see change. I've been working on this issue for about 2 decades now, 24 years or so, ever since 9/11, really, when I started writing about Islamophobia in Europe. And, the question of ethnic representation or racial representation has taken more momentum since the Black Lives Matter movement, and the killing of George Floyd. I mean, I brought up the question of Brussels, #Brussels so white.
Right.
Obviously, Ryan Heath at Politico had done so as well, a good friend of mine. So I think I see change, but I see it reluctant change, under pressure change. But some people, I have to say, are really moving forward with energy and determination. So a bit of both.
Yeah, I think there are some people who experiment and who are quite good at really trying a combination of new media. I love the fact that you said you started with a newsletter, because newsletters are now all the rage. I mean, it's like people rediscover email and say, wait, we can send out something to thousands of people. And they're working surprisingly well. Substack, Dave Keating is doing some publishing there. A lot of people are really using it. So I think it is very interesting, and it's a kind of translation of some of the work they used to do elsewhere. But it's also telling perhaps a more personal story. Now, you mentioned diversity, which is something that, as you mentioned, you're very focused on. Now, we've had elections this year, more elections that we can count in the EU, in the US. Those elections have been pretty polarizing. You mentioned the extreme right. In the US, I think we can kind of say that the far right equivalent kind of won this election cycle and has been pushing back very, very hard on diversity and inclusion, and almost making that something that they really want to stop having conversations about that. So, what are your views on that movement, and how do you think it's going to affect the EU?
Thank you for that. I mean, let me just first say very clearly, Philip, the reason I push for diversity is not just for representation's sake. It's a question of bringing diversity of views into the story as well. And I think our talent, which lies in our ethnic communities, our minorities, is not being used as usefully as it could be for the future of Europe. So it's not just a question of bring in the brown people because they're all good. Bring in the good people, and many of them are brown. We don't know it, or black. So let's bring them in. So I want to be sure about this. It's about moving away from Eurocentrism, really, in our minds, and I think that's important. Look, there's a great pushback against diversity here in Europe as well. I mean, in France, in Germany, in Austria. In Hungary, of course, as well. And of course, now in the European Parliament, there's pushback against gender equality as well. There's pushback against LGBTQI rights, a pushback against Roma. We're all seen as a threat to the power of the establishment. And the establishment so far has been run by, old white men. And so there's a reluctance to cede that power. There's a sense of entitlement. But, history doesn't stop. I mean, the number of people in our communities, the Black and brown communities, the Muslims, are growing in number, but also becoming very active in politics, in society, in economics. They're pushing back. I mean, there's a lot of, you've seen this now, Philip, in Amsterdam after the riots. The Dutch media and the Dutch politicians are really, really hammering down hard on Muslims, for instance, Dutch Muslims. And the Muslims are fighting back. The Dutch Muslims are fighting back because now they know we know our rights. We're educated. We're part of the system also. So I don't think you can stop history. And I think Donald Trump will realize that as well. America is changing very fast. And in Europe, we'll just have to get used to the fact that power has to be shared. And when you share power, you're actually, in a sense, not in the old sense of, you have the big stick, but in the real sense of having influence and playing a role in this changing world. That's where power comes from. Power comes from diversity. And without diversity, Philip, really have functioning democracies.
Yeah, no, I think it's very, very, very insightful points. We've seen during the local election, actually, in Brussels, which Brussels is a very diverse city. If you look at the mix, and I think there was more of that represented at a local level at the elections, the election communale, than perhaps at a European or national level, which I think is interesting. I also think there's a kind of paradox with what you see in the UK, for example, where you see British candidates being from ethnic minorities, where that's not an issue. It's not really part of the conversation. It's basically accepted. And for some parties, like the conservative parties, that take a very anti-immigrant position. So I think you now have this kind of interesting, I would say, new paradigm where there is a different form of diversity, but the topics have nonetheless moved to the right, stronger anti-immigration kind of positions. So in terms of this election conversation, this increased polarization, how much damage do you think this can potentially do to the EU and the international organizations that I believe you were saying that were part of the DNA of the EU? Do you think they're going to survive this age of much more nativist and polarized discussions?
I wrote a piece for The Guardian before the European elections, Philip, in which I said I was really, really terrified of what was happening because, for some people it's a drama, it's a soap series. You watch it from the outside, but some of us really literally have skin in the game. And when I hear, Islamophobic or anti-Black racism coming so openly and so disgustingly sort of carried all over our parliaments, speeches by some of our parliamentarians, whether they're national or whether they're at the European level, it's heartbreaking because I believe in Europe. And just to give you an idea of where I'm coming from, I was born in a country, Pakistan. Came here when I was 18, and the country I was born in was is still a very unequal country. You've been to India, you know what inequality is like in South Asia. So it really, really touched me. And when I came here, what I really loved about, and also there was this constant friction, animosity between India and Pakistan. There were two wars, and those really deeply impacted on me because I was fed up of that. I come to Europe and I start literally falling in love with the EU, with all its values and the principles it talks about. So for the last, 30 years, that was wonderful. Europe was me, I was Europe. I felt comfortable here. And I think I was adopted by Europe as well. So, it was a wonderful relationship. And now I see the strains that are coming in. And what worries me is, of course, the extreme right, the fact that it's, resurgent, if you like. But what's really scary, Philip, is that the center is amplifying, adopting, and embracing the hateful rhetoric, the divisive rhetoric of the far right. And that, I think, for me, is the most painful thing to say. And how we're going to come out of it is when the progressives with a small p, the liberals with a small l, start really standing up for what they believe in rather than trying and emulating the far right. And that's not happening at the moment. And that's what really scares me. I don't think as I said earlier, Philip, I don't think you can stop history. People are not going to go away. You can build the biggest walls and the fences, and your fortress Europe can be reinforced, but the world is changing. People travel around. You've just seen in Germany, they're trying to say, no, Syria's okay now. Let's set the Syrians back. And then even the health minister says, well, hey, wait a minute, we've got thousands of Syrians working as doctors in our system. What's going to happen to our health system? Essential workers across Europe are normally Black and brown people, really are. So you can't stop history. You can't stop change. There's always pushback, but as I said to you, we are pushing back too.
Yeah, no, I think very, very good points. And in fact, I discussed this earlier with Alberto Alemano, which is the Overton window, where, what was acceptable before has kind of shifted, and suddenly you can say things that were seen as outrageous and it's become normalized. And I think what you say is particularly interesting because being a moderate now has become radical. Saying things that used to be pretty part of the consensus, like, oh wow, you're not being an extremist, so you're kind of being in the middle. And I think that as you said, people need to reclaim that story. And there's a very powerful story that behind the EU, behind these global values, that has really lost a lot of energy, a lot of potency because of the changes that we've seen. Now, in terms of how this conversation came about during the election cycles that we've seen people emerging from new spaces. We have, of course, Trump using new media very effectively. Some people say that his podcast interview with Joe Rogan might have helped move the needle, but it wasn't just that. He deliberately avoided traditional media to go and really connect with this new media space. X has become a political tool for Trump. I mean, it's there's no secrets behind this. This used to be an outrageous idea, the idea that social channels would become purely political, and suddenly that just disappeared in the last election cycle. So what do you think about the role of these channels in shaping political opinion, both globally and in particular in the EU?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's heartbreaking to see what's happening to Twitter, to X, really. I'm still from the generation that sort of, used it and become attached to it. That's where I have to say, that's where I found a lot of friends and allies and supporters, because sometimes in Brussels it's very difficult to find that kind of allyship on issues that matter to me, multipolarity, global South, diversity, equity. These are not topics, Philip, I think you'll know that are really mainstream in Brussels. So when you're speaking about these issues, you need to find allyship and friends. So I found those a lot on Twitter, and also, as I said, when I'm writing about geopolitics, writing about what's happening in Gaza or Sudan, Myanmar, that's where the voices are from, and that they become my friends too, because then I can reach out to them, and it's such a useful tool for research. So it's heartbreaking to see how it's being destroyed by Elon Musk. I mean, seriously, I think that's he's damaging a global public good, and there should be much more of an outcry against that. So I'm moving, as I said to you, I'm moving to Blue Sky. I've moved, actually. Made the transition. I use Instagram. Instagram I use for more sort of pictures and, sort of highlights of where I've been. I use Mastodon a little bit. I use Threads, I use LinkedIn, but I find LinkedIn very smug and complacent, I have to say. And so I use it, obviously, for professional purposes. So there's a variety there, but I have to say, giving up, I will not give up totally on X for the moment for all the reasons I've given you, but I am transiting to Blue Sky. And I'm also, I think I'm going to start my own Substack as well, because I think some of these questions that I'm dealing with, really need to be repeatedly put on the agenda. And then, of course, I'm delighted that I can write for the EU Observer, for Guardian, Hyphen Online, and some journals in Asia and Africa as well. So, its diversity is there. I think we all have to pick and choose. You can't abandon something completely, I think, for the moment. And that, I think, is true in all our different facets of society and politics as well, isn't it? There's a bit of good and a bit of bad, and we just have to be very circumspect and make the right
Yeah.
decisions, hopefully.
Yeah, I think this has been very challenging for people who have a lot of experience and a community on Twitter X, where and we're seeing this. We've had this conversation during the EU influencer, people saying they should leave X because of the politicization of the platform. Other people saying you still have to be where the conversation is. So and I think a very good point that was made recently is. You don't want to just end up in a complete bubble. So let's assume that Blue Sky takes off and it's kind of starting to work quite well in the EU. So it could become a kind of viable space. But if you completely desert X, then it becomes, again, it reinforces the bubbles and polarization. So and also disinformation will spread with nobody, with no checks. Nothing that can stop it. So when you meet people who are entering into this world, let's talk about students, young people. What do you tell them are the things they need to learn in this new world with lots of channels, a lot of disinformation, tremendous uncertainty? What is your advice to them?
Yeah, just one word on what you said about disinformation. It's not just on social media, Philip. Disinformation, fake news, misinformation is also on mainstream media.
Of course.
And we've seen that, of course, recently with the Israel-Palestine war, how many untruths have been put out there by very, very renowned newspapers. So I say that to my students as well. I teach at the College of Europe, and one of the first things I say to people is to come out of your comfort zone, because they write essays for me, my students, on this and that, and this is what I would say to young people: is go outside your comfort zone. It's not just about the mainstream Western media. Read the media, read the bloggers, read the think tankers, read the reports that are coming out of other countries, the global South, for instance. Right? I say global South, South, and I mean, the wide world outside this little bubble of Europe, because Europe is a bubble in many ways. The things we talk are very first world issues. So open your mind, go out of your comfort zone, and challenge yourselves. Challenge your privilege, your sense of care about things. I think journalism today, as we said, is very personal. So if you're coming into this world, don't be apologetic about bringing in your story and why you're interested in certain topics. Go for it. And I especially tell women to stop being so modest. I think women journalists, I mean, I'm not really an expert on this topic, but this may be a stupid question. This may not be what I should be asking. And then they ask a question. And the question they ask is brilliant. It's just the right question to ask. So, I think a lot of us women journalists, but also, younger men, are shy and modest. And I think, in this bubble, we have to stop doing that and be more visible and more audible in a sense. So basically, it's like, don't let them put you down. Stand up for yourselves. It's not easy. It's a very sort of status quo establishment kind of environment. It's not easy to do, but I think we just have to keep going. And you will always in a room find some sympathetic, find a mentor. I think finding a mentor in the system is quite important, someone who can, help you. I do that quite a bit when I have time. And just persist, send those stories in. Do your Twitter accounts, do the switch, go to, Blue Sky, put your stories out and people will notice. I think those are some of the advice I would give, Phil.
Excellent. I think asking questions, standing up, and telling your story. I think that's very good advice, and looking for mentors. I have 2 kids who are young adults now, 1 daughter, 1 son. I think I always tell them, ask as many questions as you can, especially when you're in a situation where you don't know. It's fine. And, be the person who asks the question that might sound silly, but that's the only way to start that learning process. So I think excellent advice. Okay, so now it's time for our recommendations. So roll jingle.
Recommendations of the week.
So, Shada, you have a couple of recommendations for our listeners. Tell us, what would you recommend to read or listen to?
So I'm going to spotlight James Cantor's EU Scream. I've done some work with him as well, so it's a bit self-interested, but I really think EU Scream brings a new freshness to the EU debate and the diversity that we were talking about. I mean, James goes into areas that others don't. When it comes to books, I've just read The Message by Ta-Nehisi Coates. It's just the most amazing book. It's beautifully written. Of course, it's about the Palestine and also about his visit to Senegal. But he brings an empathy, and he's just the most amazing writer. And then there's a book that I've read also, which I love literature, Philip. And in these troubled times, I'm reading books and poetry. And it's by Elif Shafak. It's called There Are Rivers in the Sky. And that's a beautiful story that goes from, Dickinson, England, to modern day Egypt and Syria and stuff. So these are my recommendations.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. That's great. We're going to share the description in the link. I actually went back to a book that I read some time back. This is The 10 Lessons for a Post-Pandemic World by Fareed Zakaria. And interesting, because he wrote this after COVID. And, it's really, I think in a new year, it's the time to say, what were we thinking about what was going to happen in the next couple of years? And so he identified several trends, some of them concerning trends, some of them where he was being optimistic. And I think what's really interesting is, okay, now that we're a couple of years later, it's almost like COVID was, 10 years ago, and yet it's still just around the corner. And we have all these new trends shaping the future. But even now, I feel that, it's really difficult to figure out what's going to happen in the next 5 years. We have so many uncertainties, so many things that are moving in the political landscape, the international institutions, conflicts all over the world. So a good read to kind of just step back and reflect about the next 5 years. So thank you so much for being with us and for sharing these very, very interesting insights. Let's continue our conversation online. Have a fantastic day and see you around. Thank you.
Thank you so much for watching this episode of the ZNL podcast. Did you like it? If so, please share it on your social media, subscribe, and give us a comment. We will see you again on the next episode. Until then, remember, stay always one step ahead.